I really don't like the stigma, because the stigma just comes from the war on drugs, the deliberate stigmatization of these drugs as part of a government policy to, put a lot of people in prison. It's just been awful.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about psychedelics and plant medicine, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is a very special guest, Dr. Peter Grinspoon. Peter, tell us about yourself.
Well, Scott, first of all, thank you for inviting me on Webdelics. This is just a wonderful show. I'm a primary care doctor in Boston. I work at Massachusetts General Hospital. I teach at Harvard Medical School, and I've been interested in cannabis for my entire life, mostly for two reasons. One, when I was growing up, my brother Danny fought an unsuccessful battle with childhood leukemia, but my parents bought him cannabis illegally in the 1970s, the early 1970s, right when Nixon was starting his war on drugs. And it was incredible how much it helped him with his symptoms, the nausea, the weight loss, the pain, the anxiety. So I, from a very early age, like 8 years old, I saw that cannabis was in fact a medicine. And now as a physician, I've been treating people with medical cannabis for about 25 years. The other thing is my dad, Dr. Lester Grinspoon, was a very prominent cannabis specialist at Harvard as well. And he wrote a book in 1971 called Marijuana Reconsidered, arguing against the criminalization of cannabis way back then, right again when the war on drugs was starting up. He also wrote a book in 1979 called Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered, calling from the rooftops for the use of psychedelics and for the research into the use of psychedelics in psychiatry. He was a little bit ahead of his time, so he got kind of crucified by Harvard, but he really helped pave the way. So I've been involved in these issues literally my entire professional adult life.
Wow. There is so much to talk about, even within what you just said, that I kind of don't know where to start, but I will step back a minute after that incredible self-introduction and segue right into our theme for the day, which is whether cannabis actually is a psychedelic. So, obviously, your history in this is very, very long in time span, and it is very, very deep. And I just have to comment, thinking about your credentials here and having just heard them, they're impressive.
Thank you.
Let's just start with some basic questions here. How are cannabis and psychedelics alike?
Well, they both change your consciousness. Cannabis is interesting. At a low dose, it doesn't act in a particularly quote unquote psychedelic fashion. But if you were to take a high dose, there would be distortions. You close your eyes, you see all kinds of beautiful shapes and colors. So I think cannabis gets more psychedelic the higher a dose you get. Now, at higher doses, some people get very anxious. So higher doses aren't for everybody. And in the question of, I might be jumping ahead a little bit, Scott, but in the question of is cannabis a psychedelic, there are the answer is it depends a little bit on what you mean by psychedelic. There are classic psychedelics, right, like mushrooms, LSD, that tickle the serotonin receptors. And then there are these other groups like ketamine and MDMA, ecstasy, which have nothing to do with the serotonin receptors or little to do with the serotonin receptors. And they're also considered psychedelics. So I think if like non-serotonin medications that distort your consciousness and help you with personal growth, like ketamine and ecstasy, can also be included in psychedelics in addition to the classical psychedelics, I don't see why on earth cannabis wouldn't be included. Cannabis doesn't, at high doses, might have some effect on the serotonin receptors. There's some interesting research into that, but generally it acts on the cannabinoid receptor. So that's very different. But again, ketamine acts on the glutamate receptors. Ecstasy reacts on God knows what receptors. So it's, I would definitely say cannabis can be a psychedelic. It's not like, you can think of a low dose like microdosing, and a higher dose like a full psychedelic experience. It's not as sort of universe altering a psychedelic as something like ayahuasca, but it certainly is a psychedelic.
Before we dive into the answer that you just gave to that question, it was very illuminating. Thank you for that. I just want to make sure that anyone whatsoever who is listening to or watching this episode has clarity as to the language being used. You've described various types of receptors. Can you explain in the most lay terms possible what a receptor is and what the various types of receptors are that you talked about? Like, what is the difference between a cannabinoid, and I know I mispronounced that, receptor, versus a serotonin receptor versus some of the other types of receptors that you mentioned?
Absolutely. Our receptors are the natural sort of molecules in our body that make us able to respond to different chemicals that are floating through our blood, different neurotransmitter systems. Most people have heard of the fight or flight system, which is just your adrenaline or epinephrine receptor system, consisting of molecules in our blood and little receptors in our brain, like lock and key, so that the molecules can have an effect. Many people have heard of serotonin receptors. Many people are on SSRIs, selective serotonin receptor inhibitors. There's more serotonin to go, more of the molecule to connect with the receptors in our brains to ideally make us happier and more relaxed. So there are dozens of different types of receptor systems in our body. Some of them, the GABA ones, are how like alcohol and Ambien work. They make us sleepy. Others are more excitatory. The one I mentioned before, the glutamate, and just these different drugs all work on these different receptors. There have to be some receptors in our bodies for the chemicals to work on, or they wouldn't affect our brains. They wouldn't affect our moods. They wouldn't affect our consciousness. And the point I was making before is that one group of psychedelics, the classical ones, the mescaline, the DMT, the ayahuasca, the mushrooms, the LSD, they all work on a certain type of serotonin receptors, different from the SSRI receptors, but very close. Whereas other psychedelic drugs, like ketamine, work in a very, very different manner. And then cannabis works in another very different manner. We have these natural cannabis-like receptors in our brains. We always have. And that's why cannabis works on humans. It has an effect. If we didn't have receptors for it, it wouldn't have an effect. So the different receptors modulate and control everything in our body, from like being hungry to being sleepy to learning, memory. And it's important to understand that there are different receptors because the different drugs act on different receptors, and that really helps us understand the benefits and the harms of each of these drugs.
So helpful. Thank you for breaking that down. Now, you mentioned in passing a few seconds ago when you talked about the classic psychedelics as well as some of the other less quote-unquote classic psychedelics that nonetheless are classified as psychedelics in common parlance right now as having a personal self-development impact on the human brain and how we experience them. You also included, when you made that statement, cannabis. When people think about cannabis, at least the homies that I hang out with, we ain't thinking about that as a personal self-development tool. We're thinking about it as a way to ease medical symptoms, like you talked about with your brother earlier, or we may think about it as a way to chill out or to have some recreational fun. But the quality of the experience that even most lay people associate with psychedelics from a personal development perspective seems to me, at least as a layperson, to qualitatively differ from that of cannabis. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure the answer to that is fully known yet, because cannabis research has been very difficult because of the war on drugs, as of course has been research into the different psychedelics. But I agree that cannabis can be very helpful for a whole variety of medical symptoms and conditions, and it helps people relax and connect. But at the same time, I have a whole chapter in my recent book, Seeing Through the Smoke, about this, about personal growth and development, sort of lifestyle enhancement with cannabis. Cannabis can also, in part because it helps people mindfully ground themselves in the present and focused right on the world around them, can really help people appreciate sex, music, art, literature, nature a lot better. And a lot of people find that cannabis can give them insight. It gives them like thoughts that they wouldn't have. Like my father wrote about this. He said that whenever he had to think about something important, he'd think about it straight, and then he'd think about it stoned, and then he'd sort of decide which are the better ideas in the two states. The editing has to be done when you're straight. But, and in my book, I cite a lot of the work of the astronomer Carl Sagan, the most brilliant person I've ever met by far. And, apologies to everybody else I've met, but he really was smart.
And I just have to interrupt. You've actually met him. I kind of love even just knowing that. He's one of my favorite people, so I wish I knew him.
He was a fixture of my childhood. He was a good friend of my dad's. And in my dad's 1971 book, Marijuana Reconsidered, he wrote a long chapter about how it facilitates his process of scientific discovery and creativity. In my dad's book, he signed it Mr. X because he didn't want to lose all his NASA contracts for admitting that he used cannabis, which is so sad. When he died in the early 1990s, my dad spilled the beans that Carl Sagan was Mr. X. And this essay about Carl Sagan's scientific process and how cannabis potentiates it, you just Google Carl Sagan cannabis and it comes right up. Or Carl Sagan.
I just have to say, Peter, one of the things I love about podcasting is that we get to go on these little digressions like this, and this was maybe the best digression I've had in a little while. Thank you for that. Now, what were we talking about? Let's get back to
so I was just making the point that cannabis can help people with insight and creativity, and I've actually experienced that. I'm going to get crucified for saying this as a doctor. We're only allowed to drink ourselves to death. We're not allowed to use cannabis, but or to take prescription drugs which pollute our minds and bodies. But I've had so many experiences where it's just given me insights where I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And, I write them down and then the next day I look at them, and some of them are really silly, but some of them are very deep and meaningful. And I just really think that cannabis can help people know each other. It can help them know themselves. And if used properly, I mean, for me to have insight from using cannabis, I'd have to use like a small dose, not what we were talking about earlier, like a psychedelic dose. Mm-hmm. If I took a huge dose, I'd be too high to have any insight. But if you take just a little bit, it could really help with communication with people that you're close to, and it can really help you look at different problems and issues in a slightly different way than you would have ordinarily. And I think it can really help people with their personal growth and development for a variety of ways. Number one, with the insight that I just talked about. Number two, with the creativity that it helps people generate. And number three, with the sort of mindful presentness in the moment. And number four, if they're suffering less from nausea or chronic pain, they're going to be more able to focus on their interpersonal connections and their personal growth and development. So I think in many ways, cannabis can facilitate that.
Well, and let's hit another nail on the head that you have mentioned in passing a couple of times. One of the foundational impacts that psychedelic use can have on people is a heightening of that sense of connection. And if you're saying cannabis can do the exact same thing, then that's a pretty significant similarity. Leaving aside personal growth, maybe they can't be separated from each other fully, but at a minimum, let's say you can separate personal growth from a sense of connection to other people. If these plants are all doing the same thing, then there's a similarity that has profound implications for our culture, for how we view ourselves, and a whole host of other things that have been the subject of a number of different interviews on this podcast.
I agree with you, and definitely, Scott. And I know you've covered a lot of this stuff before in Webdelics, but psychedelics have been studied more in some ways than cannabis has for their positive potential. Because remember, cannabis research over the last 50 years, because of the war on drugs, to get any money to study cannabis, you had to show a drop in something like sperm count or motivation or IQ, none of which turned out to be true. And you had to show some harm. And now they're doing all these very positive studies in psychedelics. And for example, a recent one, which is related to what we're talking about, is that psychedelics can help open social learning networks, which is part of how they help people connect with each other and how they help people heal from trauma. And I would bet you a cup of coffee that if you studied cannabis, it would also open help reopen social learning networks in exactly the way that I just discussed. But it's just the kind of thing that hasn't been studied because the psychiatric community, and I talk a lot about why this is the case in my book, has been sort of anti-cannabis but pro-psychedelics, even though I think it's an artificial dichotomy.
Well, on the subject of coffee, which I will add for those who are listening and not watching, both Peter and I are drinking. It tastes
I
so
would say
good.
it's my favorite plant-based medicinal
Right. Tell me about it. But that being said, it's making it sound like cannabis and psychedelics are exactly the same. That can't be true, can it? How are
No,
they different?
they're pretty different. I mean, again, at a low dose cannabis, you feel it. At a low dose, people microdosing, you don't feel it. And at a higher dose, to have the kind of disruption in your sense of reality that you get with most psychedelics, you'd have to take a huge dose of cannabis. And if a person takes a puff or two at a party, that's not really psychedelic. That's just making them feel energetic and connected. Again, it's only if you take a very large dose, like a big edible, that you close your eyes and you start seeing colors, and it's very pretty, but it's a very, very heavy dose. And I think that reliably, when you take a substantial dose of mushrooms or acid or ayahuasca, you have these like earth-shattering experiences where your ego dissolves and you're truly connected with other people and with the natural world. And cannabis doesn't work as dramatically as that. It's a lot more subtle. So I think the best way to describe it is I describe cannabis as a psychedelic light.
Well, they both have had historical stigmas, as everyone under the sun knows, and as you've referenced yourself. To what extent are these stigmas deserved? Not just generally, but to what extent is the stigma around cannabis deserved? To what extent is the stigma around plant medicine and psychedelics deserved?
I would say exactly 0%. There is absolutely no reason for us to have a stigma against plant-based medications, whether they're psychedelics or cannabis. We do need a healthy respect for how strong they can be and what some of the potential harms could be, and how to use them wisely and safely to keep people healthy and to help them improve their health. I mean, you don't want people with schizophrenia taking psychedelics, or bipolar can really destabilize them. Same with cannabis. So there are certainly potential harms to these, but I really don't like the stigma, because the stigma just comes from the war on drugs, the deliberate stigmatization of these drugs as part of a government policy to, put a lot of people in prison. It's just been awful. And what stigma does is it makes it so that people can't be open about their use and can't ask for help if they're in trouble. And again, psychedelics aren't for everybody. Cannabis certainly isn't for everybody. Some people it makes too sleepy. Some people it makes really paranoid. They're both helpful tools that for many people can be helpful. And all the stigma does is make people feel bad about themselves. It makes it so they don't talk about it with their doctors or nurses. And it makes it so they can't ask for help and don't have community in what they're doing. So I think the stigma is 100% harmful and should be completely eradicated to the extent we can from all discussion and perceptions of any plant-based medication, and should be replaced with realistic, neutral education and sensible regulation of these drugs/medications, so that people can get them, but they're not handed out like candy, so that people who shouldn't get them can't get them. So we could do a lot better. We're heading in the right direction, though.
We're going to get to that part of the discussion in a few moments. We are 100% going to talk about handing them out like candy and what decriminalization looks like and harm reduction, all of that sort of stuff in a moment. Let's, though, follow up on something else that everything that you've said so far raises, at least to my mind, which is, if cannabis and psychedelics are similar, but not quite the same, can they work together? And by the way, should you be using them together? It's potentially awesome or potentially terrifying, at least to my little ears.
Well, that's a complicated question. The first answer is that it needs to be studied more. The second answer is that you want to do it with extreme caution, because if, psychedelics are already you're out there, and if cannabis can push you further out there, that It could be a good thing or a bad thing, but you definitely don't want to be more out there than you're intending or planning. The third point is that tons of people use cannabis and psychedelics together. And, you know, kind of the word on the street is that cannabis, for example, can really help potentiate the effects of mushrooms. I was just reading a study about this recently, but I can't remember exactly what the point of it was. But it was about cannabis and mushrooms really, cannabis helping potentiate some of the experiences that people were trying to get with mushrooms. And then just in my youth, I've done cannabis and psychedelics together a million times, and they're fun. They work well together. But I don't recommend that as a doctor. I'm just saying from my experience in the past.
Well, and let's again hit some language here. $5 words get my little mind confused. Peter, I'll keep it real. When you say that cannabis can help potentiate mushroom experiences, what exactly does that mean, and how does that look? I just don't understand. I'm sorry, my brother.
So you take some mushrooms, you're waiting like half an hour for them to kick in. People will smoke a little bit of cannabis. It'll help them kick in a little faster, and it'll make the mushroom trip kind of fuller and deeper because you're not just tickling the serotonin receptors, as we talked about before, you're tickling the cannabis receptors, and they could work together, many people think, to give you an even deeper experience than either one of them alone. So they sort of work together in the sum is greater than the whole of the parts type way. And that's the argument for it. Again, I think this needs to be studied more. And, you know, you certainly don't want people doing too many drugs at one time. That can be dangerous. But I have heard, and I know many people that use them together and think that they really do sort of mutually enhance the other so that they work really well together to give a very meaningful and pleasing psychedelic experience.
With regards to everything that we've talked about, but particularly this last subject, do we know if it matters whether the cannabis is ingested or smoked?
Well, I'm not, doctors aren't huge fans of smoking anything. So we don't really recommend people smoke it. If you take a puff once a week at a party, you're not going to hurt your lungs. But if someone's like puffing on their vape pen, every 20 minutes, that can't possibly be good for your lungs. But I think that in this particular case, I'm just thinking out of the box here, smoking would probably be a little bit safer because it is easier to titrate the dose and it doesn't last as long. So if you take a puff, you could know pretty soon if you want another puff or not. And then if you overdo it, it wears off in a couple hours. You take an edible, you don't really feel it for an hour, and then by the time you feel it, the psychedelic's hitting and the edible's hitting, and the edible lasts for like 8 hours. It lasts a really long time. So if you screw up the dose, you're going to be really out of it. And furthermore, taking too much cannabis can cause people to have anxiety. Taking mushrooms can cause too much people to have anxiety. So you have to be very careful taking both of them. And I'd be much more concerned about an edible that you can't really titrate the dose as easily and that doesn't kick in for an hour because people might overdo it. And then you're stuck with it for 8 hours. And if you're on too much cannabis, on too many mushrooms, or you're on too much cannabis and too many mushrooms, that could be a very, very long 8 hours.
Yeah, it sounds terrifying. By the way, titrate, another $10 word. Peter, what does it mean?
Titrate means just like slowly getting yourself to the right dose. Like something that you feel right away, you can titrate up more accurately. Like a puff of cannabis, you wait a minute, say you have chemotherapy and you have nausea, and you can see if you need another puff. Whereas if you take an edible, there's no effect for like an hour. So how do you know if you need another dose, a higher dose, a lower dose? It's like, a roulette wheel. You're just sort of throwing a dart. You're just not entirely sure unless you take the same dose every day and you figure out what your dose is. So it's easier to rapidly get up to the right dose with something fast acting, like something under the tongue, or like something inhaled, than it is something that you swallow that doesn't kick in for an hour. So titrating is just the medical word. I'm sorry using all these words because I'm caffeinated for getting yourself up to the right dose and not beyond the right dose. And again, with cannabis and psychedelics, you don't want to overshoot. That is not fun. Absolutely not fun to take too much cannabis. Absolutely not fun to take too much of any psychedelic. And the dose is different for everybody. It depends on your personal experience and just on how your brain works. So we definitely want to work our way up and not take huge doses of any of this stuff right away.
Well, you're diving right into the next series of questions that I had, which were around harm reduction. So one thing that I'm hearing then is, look, think carefully if you feel you absolutely have to use them together, and maybe you don't have to use them together. But when you think about harm reduction for cannabis versus the various psychedelics, and I understand there might be specifics related to the various psychedelic substances, but generally, how do they differ?
Oh, well, first of all, harm reduction is a really important topic. And just to circle back for a second, people should only use cannabis and a psychedelic if they're very experienced with both cannabis and with psychedelics, not for novices. So I was only talking about very, very experienced psychonauts, not your beginner.
And so if my homie Shane up the streets offers me both and says, well, boy, Scott, you'll have a good time, you're telling me I need to like chill out and maybe wait till I've learned a thing or two and been around the block, right?
I would say if you feel comfortable with either substance, you might want to experiment adding a little bit, doing them at the same time, but only if you're very, very comfortable. Yeah, there's a wide range of comfort. Most people have never done psychedelics. Some people are very, very comfortable with them. In terms of harm reduction, and this goes for all the psychedelics, you use the lowest dose possible that gives you the effect that you want. Sometimes it's an educated guess, but you certainly, especially at the very beginning when you're just getting used to it, do not want to take a big dose. That can be terrifying, a very bad experience. I think a lot of harm reduction can be accomplished if we decriminalize psychedelics, which I know we're going to talk about, because then people could know that they're getting a safe product. They could actually know that 100 micrograms of acid is 100 micrograms of acid. It's not anywhere between 3 and 4,000. They know the mushrooms aren't tainted with anything, or the ecstasy doesn't have fentanyl in it. And also, as we talked about before, that lessens the stigma and brings things out of the shadows. So people can talk to their doctors. People can if they're getting into trouble, they can call the police and say, I'm having trouble, and not worry about getting arrested. As it is now, nobody calls the police if they're having a bad experience. Not that the police are the most, well-trained to deal with this, but it's much better if they're trying to help than trying to arrest you. And then you could always have a trip sitter with you, either an experienced guide or just a trusted friend that will be with you that won't be on psychedelics, that can spend time with you, be with you, take care of any emergencies or discomforts that arise. And in the really rare instances that you are getting super anxious, can help talk you down or get you any help that you need. So I think that there is a lot of harm reduction we could do with psychedelics, mostly around standardizing the dose, giving people a safe supply, getting things out of the shadows, and have someone accompanying them so that they have a trip sitter, and then finally using the lowest dose possible. You don't have to take a heroic dose and discover all the secrets of the universe on your first psychedelic experience. You can work your way up to that.
Appreciate that. Now, I am having this conversation from New York City. And when I walk outside onto the streets of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, wherever I might be, we have cannabis dispensaries everywhere. And there has been a significant social, for lack of a better word, conversation about the impact of these dispensaries and the more freewheeling approach to cannabis distribution on the quality of life, particularly in a dense city like New York. That being said, even if a city has these dispensaries popping up and it's not as densely populated as New York is, hey, New Yorkers are used to dealing with a lot. And so if we're complaining about it, I can only imagine that even if the city has less people around any dispensary, people might be rightfully concerned about quality of life. Decriminalization of psychedelics raises similar issues, at least in the public mind. How might decriminalization look for psychedelics versus how it is looking for cannabis, particularly with regards to concerns about public safety and quality of life?
Well, that was about 6 questions, but well,
It was. So if you want me to break it down, I will.
no,
If
no,
you
no,
just
no,
want to
I'm
go
good. I'm
for it,
good.
I'll.
I'm good. Thanks, Scott. So first of all, a lot of the stores in New York are illegal. And it's very concerning the quality of the product they sell. You hear that they get hemp and spray it with Delta 8, one of these semi-synthetic new cannabinoids, and then call it marijuana. I think that the other side of decriminalization is regulation. It can't just be decriminalized with no regulation. So I would envision for psychedelics taking away the criminal penalties, allowing people to grow mushrooms, allowing people to gift them to each other but not sell them to each other, but also having them sort of dispensed through like government stores so that you need to have some accountability and perhaps some education. That way you'd know that your product is safe. People would be able to track it. We'd make tax money from it. And we wouldn't have this major free-for-all of like illegal stores all over the place, which in New York, nobody really knows how to close. Nobody wants to be like raiding these stores like the war on drugs. That goes against the whole ethos of legalizing. But at the same time, they really need to have legal cannabis stores that are creating revenue for the state and that are producing a safe product. So, and in Massachusetts, of course, we have an illicit market like they do everywhere. And that's a big problem with legalization or decriminalization. But generally speaking, we did it a lot better than New York did. Sorry to people in New York, but the stores are excellent. Everything's really coherently regulated. They regulate the cannabis from the seed through the growth cycle and transportation and testing all the way to the sale at the dispensary. It's tracked. And if you go into a dispensary in Massachusetts, you're essentially guaranteed of getting a cannabis product that's free of pesticides and heavy metals, that's accurately labeled, and that doesn't have pesticides in it. So it can be done in a good way. Psychedelics are a little bit more complicated than cannabis because there's more potential for harm. Because you wouldn't want a free for all like cannabis. You don't want a bud tender upselling someone, oh, if you have fun with 100 micrograms of acid, you'll have a great time with 400 milligrams, and we have a 4-for-1 special. I mean, that would be a disaster. So
And people would do that too, by the way.
absolutely. So I don't see it as a free-for-all, but I do think that decriminalization, and again, I don't have all the answers, but I do think that decriminalization coupled with sensible and reasonable regulation would work far better than, on the one hand, free-for-all, on the other hand, criminalization, which makes everything more dangerous.
You have given us a lot of information and a lot to think about. When I consider everything that you just shared with us, one takeaway that I have is that, let me step back a little bit. When I first started doing this podcast, I got a lot of people telling me that they knew people in the cannabis world that they could introduce me to. And I had to develop some language to be able to let people know that cannabis and psychedelics weren't exactly the same, that this was really focused on psychedelics, not pot or any of the other plants related to pot. And over time, the question as to why this confusion was occurring did arise. These are related substances. They might, for people who are experienced, work together effectively. More study 100% needs to happen around that before that could be said with certainty at all, as I'm understanding it. But the movements that are involved in the decriminalization, legalization, and the destigmatization of them actually overlap to some extent, perhaps more than I originally thought when beginning this show. And that's why, as the audience representative, the person who is learning along with everyone who's listening to and watching this show, this episode has been so important. If there is a single takeaway that you would like to leave the audience with, Peter, or something else that you would like to share that you haven't had a chance to so far, what might that be?
Well, first of all, thank you. And it's always a pleasure to be on Webdelics. And I've really enjoyed this conversation, Scott. I would say that be safe. Everybody's so enthusiastic about psychedelics these days. And, every week in the Wall Street Journal even, or Condé Nast, or any mainstream publication you read about microdosing helps me as an executive. It makes me smarter and happier. And people are so enthusiastic about this. And I just think it's really important for people to be patient, make sure they're in the right set and setting, because the context in which you take cannabis or psychedelics is really important to how good an experience you're going to have. Make sure that you aren't going to get into legal trouble. Make sure that you know the dose, that it's a good product, and then make sure you have trusted people to take it with, ideally with someone who's not taking it, so that you could be safe. So I think safety comes first. And close behind safety, I'm a big believer, as we talked about, in legalizing cannabis across the board, but decriminalizing psychedelics, because I genuinely believe as long as we're not hurting other people, we have the right to experiment with our own consciousness and to improve our interpersonal relationships. So I would say safety and access are the two key points I'd like to emphasize, and that they're not unrelated. I think you could have access with good education, with good regulation that could lead to pretty good safety. Now, will there always be a small proportion of people doing irresponsible things with alcohol, with cannabis, with opiates, with psychedelics? Of course. But generally speaking, for most people, we can do this in a safe and really healthy manner.
So thought-provoking. Thank you for that, Peter. How can people find out more about you? And by the way, tell us about projects that you're working on. We want to know.
Well, I'm still promoting my book that just came out, Seeing Through the Smoke, A Cannabis Expert Untangles the Truth About Marijuana. I'm working on another book about cannabis and seniors, because that's the most rapidly growing demographic. I just signed up for this very intense training to become a psychedelic therapist, which I'm very excited about, but it's going to eat up many, many weekends. And I've been working really hard on my Substack. I have a blog that comes out every other week. The most recent one was on the potential harms of psychedelics and how to make them safer, which is why all this is on the tip of my tongue. The one before that was on how safe or unsafe is cannabis during pregnancy. And the one before that was on ibogaine. So they're all interesting blogs. So I spend a lot of my time writing and fortunately getting to do fun shows like Webdelics. I also, in my spare time, have to actually be a doctor and work as a primary care doctor at my hospital.
Peter, get to work. Thank you so much. By the way, as I take my final sip of coffee for the day after you just took your sip, perhaps we'll have another episode about whether coffee is a psychedelic. That would be interesting.
Actually, in my book, Seeing Through the Smoke, I have a section about how addictive is cannabis and how they fluffed it up. I mean, I think cannabis can be addictive, but they sort of fluffed it up for the war on drugs. Then I go through the same criteria that we have for cannabis addiction with coffee. And I am 11 for 11 with coffee. With cannabis, I was 0 for 11. It's just really funny. So I had Java use disorder, which I made up instead of cannabis use disorder.
I think I might have that disorder, and that is very illuminating to hear. Thank you so much, Peter. For those of you who are listening or watching to this episode, keep tuning in. We're going to have a lot of exciting content coming up around a whole host of different topics related to various psychedelic substances. And some of the human stories, as well as the scientific information that you're going to hear, are going to be both thought-provoking and paradigm-shifting. In the meantime, if you enjoyed today's episode and you want to learn more, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite audio platform or on YouTube. And most importantly, tell everyone that you know about what we're doing. We want to get the word out. Also, don't forget to follow Webdelics on all of our social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. And then after you've done all that, or maybe at the same time, go to our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. Sign up to our blog for trusted, vetted, and reliable information about plant medicine and psychedelics. Then, and please don't forget this one, my friends, come back again for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.